When we landed in Kandahar, it was quite the eye-opener. As soon as you land, there's fighter aircraft taking off, there's helicopters going. So you realize, my God, this is something much bigger. So the enormity of the mission really kind of hit home and what Canada was actually involved with.
We are now entering Kandahar City. Check it out.
We were driving through Kandahar City, and all I can think of is, I grew up with Star Wars. So Star Wars and Jabba the Hutt, and here we are. I'm in Star Wars. In the back of our minds was bombers and cars. There was now a resurgent Taliban, at least in the shadows.
A lot of those villages and tribes in those areas had already become so disenfranchised with their own local government that they had already turned to the Taliban. The corruption fueled the insurgency. We arrived at a time that the recruitment was well underway.
First time we came under contact, it wasn't from a bomber at all. We were driving back, and I was in my boss's vehicle, and someone fires an RPG at us. The RPG goes through one of our soft-skinned G-Wagon vehicles and goes straight underneath the back seats. The guys that were sitting in the back seat have the RPG go underneath them, go straight through. Their pants are on fire, but not badly. So they've just, clearly had a close call. That's when you realize we're an army of strangers in a land of strangers.
8-6-9.
I was a little concerned about the provincial reconstruction team going into Kandahar. One of the first things that the Taliban did in Kandahar was start killing off Red Cross workers. And that happened very early on. That happened in 2003, 2004. So the idea behind the PRT was that it would provide a little bit of protection. We knew that Kandahar was, I wouldn't call it Wild West, but maybe Wild South. And the concern was that the PRT would simply be a goat on a rope.
Officers would work with a platoon of soldiers and accompany them in their fighting vehicles to engage in discussions with village leaders throughout a whole district, one village at a time. And in those discussions, ascertain village requirements and whether or not the governance structure of the district and the province was caring about the problems of the village and doing something about it.
My job was to liaise with village elders and find out what they needed for food, water, shelter, and education. Those were my bugaboos, education. I would ask the elders if their girls could be educated. When they stopped laughing, they said, if I built them in a separate school, they could.
Why were they laughing?
Because the concept of educating girls was like educating dogs to them.
Captain Green was with Captain Shamoon in a platoon from A Company, engaged in a shura with local leaders or elders in Shinke village.
We walked in, we lay our weapons down and our helmets. It started out well. It was our third of the day. And the previous two had gone well. We were feeling good about it. And for this shura, Rob Dolson had asked to come. He was on my left.
Why do you take your helmets off?
A sign of respect.
When you're engaged in shura, you can take your helmet off, you can take your personal protective equipment off, because Pashtunwali culture demands that the host in that village guarantees your protection while you're engaged in that kind of activity. In the middle of this shura, an Afghan youth branding an axe came up behind Captain Green.
Walked up behind me, took an axe from under his robe, and sank it in his head like he was chopping a log. The axe penetrated 3 inches into my skull. My brains are leaking out. When the man on my left, Rob Dolson, managed to grab his weapon and shoot 2 rounds into the kid before he could strike again, he saved my life. Rob Dolson, my hero. And it was a signal for a Taliban ambush from across the river. And all hell broke out.
There was a firefight immediately afterwards. There were some Taliban hidden in the village. So in fact, Sinn K had been harboring a Taliban cell while they were in discussion with us. Whether or not the youth was coerced by the Talibs, we don't know.
Pushtun-Wali, the code of hospitality, had been extended to them. This is now an issue between the Afghans and the Taliban, and how the Taliban don't respect their own culture. Because this was not a breach of protocol between the Afghans and us. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got everything to do with the Afghans and how the Taliban don't respect their own culture.
After he had been wounded, a lot of agencies reassessed whether or not they were going to continue with developmental efforts. So it was a natural thing for us to move into more lethal combat operations by April of 2006.
The Taliban brought a guy named Mullah Dadullah Lang back into the fold. And Dadullah Lang was a Taliban commander who'd actually been fired by Mullah Omar for being too brutal. Dadullah Lang came back to Omar and said, listen, we've discovered a scheme here. Okay, the Americans are going to pull out of Kandahar. They're going to hand it over to the Canadians. There's a potential weakness here because the Canadians won't fight. So he convinced Mullah Omar that 2006 was the year that he could take back Kandahar City.
I had information that they had built a defensible base, a very large one in that area with compounds, defensive positions, and their sole job was to use that as a staging area to be able to launch attacks into Kandahar City. That was the purpose of it.
They planned to actually go from those bases to do a spectacular attack in Kandahar City that would get world press and demoralize NATO and make us lack credibility.
There were at least 1,500 fighters in that area, and they were ready to launch an attack into Kandahar City. I had enough information to say the force that Colonel Hope was launching was a lot smaller for the fight that we were going into. I didn't want the operation to go through, but the decision was made to launch on it.
So when Colonel Hope rolled the 1st Battalion Task Force Orion into Pashmul on the 3rd of August, they basically hit a hornet's nest.
Attention there, military history enthusiasts. Brace yourself for an unparalleled journey into the heart of warfare with History Hit, where the untold stories of desperate battles come to life. Join James Holland on a gripping road trip through Italy in Road to Victory, Italy 1943, uncovering the often overlooked campaign of the British 8th Army's landing and advance up the Italian peninsula in 1943. Next, explore the forgotten battlefields of the First World War with Alex Churchill, tracing the bloody battles that unfolded before the trenches, revealing the clash of modern weapons and Napoleonic tactics in a conflict that set the stage for the Great War. And finally, follow the one and only Rishi Sharma in Untold Stories of World War II as he raced against time to capture over 2,200 personal oral histories from living combat veterans, preserving the harrowing accounts of those who lived at the bleeding edge on the front line. Discover hundreds of hours of award-winning documentaries and ad-free podcasts with History Hit. Sign up for a special offer via the link in the description.
We mustered a company from 2 PPCLI with a task to clear the area of Highway 1.
I told Ian Hope, Ian, I need you to take the town. Where is it? I said, you just go south, and when they start shooting at you, you've reached it.
Highway 1 is the main artery that ran from the west of Kandahar City toward Helmand. Very, very important road.
We would move towards what was referred to as the White School.
Was it a school?
From what I understand, the school did exist at one point. The Taliban went in, beheaded some of the teachers. A school in name only.
The fact that we call it to this day a white school perplexes me. It was a Taliban fort. It had been built as a white school. You know, it was a big brick building that was very sturdy, and so they took it over and turned it into a fortress. On the morning of August the 3rd, the battle group launched, and really they knew that the center of Taliban resistance was going to be the White School, the Taliban fortress.
And I remember Colonel Hope saying, we're going to an extremely volatile part of the country, and we are going to see combat. And hand in hand with that, you know, he was very matter of fact about the fact that not everyone was going to come home.
I led the southern group out at about 3 in the morning. At about 4:15, we found a group of Taliban fighters in what could only be an early warning position.
We're going to send A and EMP forward to cover us as we move our way through to the blocking position.
The lead Lav 3 got on the radio and called in a contact and said, I see 6 guys with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns, and I'm asking permission to fire.
And I said yes.
So it's going to be over in that direction.
So we basically fired upon that group with concentrated Lav fire of 4 different vehicles using 25mm machine guns. There's not much left of that group once that kind of munition hits them. And then we were moving forward to actually get onto that position and find out what it was when one of our vehicles hit an IED.
There was a loud boom, and it struck the lead Lav, which was driven by Corporal Chris Reed, and he was killed.
The number of IEDs on the road prevented us from wanting to risk any more Lavs moving forward.
Colonel Hope is like, okay, we need to get there, but I'm not willing to drive down this road anymore. So we're going to do this assault on foot.
So Sergeant Ingram and I got together, and we basically figured what the best approach was up to the school. The Lavs that were already in position, it wasn't wise to move them forward. We didn't know how many IEDs were in the road.
They had about 20-25 Afghan National Police attached to John Hamilton's platoon. And as they moved forward, they sustained heavy fire from all around the White School. The Afghan National Police immediately fled the battlefield.
I called back to Colonel Hope. I said, sir, the Afghan National Police ran away. They're hiding now in a ditch. He goes, John, you have to show them how it's done. And I said, no problem, sir.
He courageously moved his forward troops into the school area, into the couple of outbuildings near the school, and said he was set there, which meant I would have to find more forces to come forward to begin the clearance. As I was beginning to plan that, it became obvious to us that he was actually in a kill zone, that the enemy had wanted this to happen.
And that's when the firing really started to pick up. Several RPGs, heavy small arms fire going over our heads. It's about maybe 11 o'clock, getting close to noon. Sun is at its peak, and it's 45, 50 degrees Celsius. It's extremely hot. I have guys going down to heat stroke.
You have to compartmentalize as a commander on a battlefield. You know these soldiers, you love these soldiers, and there's no other word appropriate for that. You love them. If they trust you, you feel that back. Committing them to what is almost certain injury and death is very, very difficult. At this point in the operation, though, I'd got over that.
So I had stayed back with those guys to provide a foot on the ground for John and the rest of the assault forces movement up to the school, and they were doing it in bounds.
By the time I got up to the school, to the objective area,
Back up.
I had 14 men. The vast majority of them were combat ineffective due to heat stroke, and also Private Kevin Dallaire was wounded at that time. Our situation was very precarious. They needed reinforcements up here as quick as possible. The fire was pretty intense. It was coming from all over the place. There's 14 Canadians against what turned out to be 150 to 200 Taliban. So I'd asked for indirect fire support from artillery. And it was denied.
Why?
By higher headquarters because of potential collateral damage, because this was called a school.
NATO's command and control philosophy out of Kabul was tight control of all combat forces. So, orders came down about tight regulations with the use of fire, indirect fire, direct fire, aircraft. So when we say school, there has to be a board convened, a targeting board with lawyers and experts in different types of fire and munitions, and somebody who knows about that actual facility, and they decide whether or not we can fire at that building.
That was why we had no fast air and we had no artillery. And on a conventional battlefield where we have all these enablers that are supposed to be at our disposal, to be denied them in a situation like that was, it was absolutely heartbreaking.
What was your feeling about that?
Yeah, I can repeat the words I used, but I was pretty upset.
One thing that will forever stick out of my mind is the radio chatter when those guys came under contact in the south. You could tell they were fighting literally for their lives. And to hear some of the voices on that radio, I'll never forget.
John Hamilton is yelling, "You have to come help us, you have to come help us, we've got casualties." So I looked at the two guys that were with me, Bryce and Mark, and I said, "Okay guys, we have to go link up with those guys." Now at this point the volume of fire is picking up, and so there's machine gun fire and small arms fire, and there's rockets coming down the road. So we got up and we started running across this field, and it was absolutely insane. It was one of those things that I think when you watch a movie and you see bullets splashing around people's feet and rocks skimming by your head and stuff like that, that's exactly what it was like. And at the time I wasn't really thinking a whole lot about it, but I remember thinking like, geez, I really hope we make it.
We were still under intense fire. Guys were fighting hard. All of a sudden, things just went black, and I felt this explosion hit.
Boom! This giant explosion, and I'm being propelled backwards across this room, and I hit the wall.
After the round hit and I opened my eyes, Von Ingram was right across from me. Von was actually, as he was dying, was providing first aid to others that were wounded as well. It just speaks to the type of man that he was.
It really became obvious that there's a lot of bad guys out there and they really want us dead. Now there's 3 dead. Kevin Dallaire is seriously wounded, like gravely injured. 6 others that are pretty beat up. So there's like 4 of us that are not injured that are still able to fight.
Went and grabbed the radio and got one transmission back, was get those f***ing lavs up here, we're gonna die. And then the radio went dead.
I put out a all arms call for fire. Basically, it's a plea from a ground commander saying, we're in trouble. If there's any aircraft out there that can help. I wasn't authorized to drop a bomb, but I was authorized for a show of force. So what the US Air Force did was send a B-1 bomber at 500 feet. Now, if you've ever been under a B-1 bomber flying at 500 feet, it's probably the equivalent of an earthquake. The entire ground shakes. It was only the Air Force coming at that critical moment that saved us and turned the tide.
Lavs were firing like crazy as they were driving up. And by the time they got to the school, so that by the time they crossed that 150 meters, all their guns were dry. They'd fired every single bullet.
Remember yelling over to Willie McDonald. I said, Willie, I said, get the f over here and help me out because I'm hurting. So eventually they came up, loaded us in the lavs. And I remember looking over at a truck full of A&P, the Afghan National Police. They were all kind of sitting in the bed of the truck there, and they were laughing. That enraged me to the point that if I had my rifle in reach, it probably would have ended extremely ugly for them. And at that point, I had no doubt in my mind they had something to do with it.
The hardest decision I ever made was at the end of August 3rd, walking away from that fight. I don't regret the decision.
Is it tough to talk about?
I've talked about it 1,000 times, and, you know, from a personal therapy perspective there, it's what's helped me the most deal with that, is talking about it and letting people know the type of heroes that fought that day. Guys like Sergeant Von Ingram, Corporal Bryce Keller, Private Kevin Dallaire, Corporal Chris Reed, guys like that. I have to talk about it because I'd be doing them an injustice if I didn't.
I was just as upset as everybody else because in knowing something that might happen, then it comes true, it weighs on you, and it weighed on me for many years. Even though we took significant casualties at the White School, and it was a tough day for everybody, that allowed us to confirm the information that led to Operation Medusa, so that eventually led to the saving of Kandahar City.
Fighting a counterinsurgency of the nature that the Taliban presented was as combat-oriented as anything we've seen since Korea or World War II. The ground that they picked was the same ground that the Mujahideen had fought on when they defeated a Russian division 30 years earlier. It's the same ground that they beat the British on in the 1800s. This is the same piece of dirt they've been fighting over for hundreds of years.
The White School was a Taliban stronghold that was being used as their base of operation.
The White School was in one of the biggest kill zones that the Taliban had created, a very large, over 1 kilometer long.
Operation Medusa was actually the second operation to take the White School.
The White School was the same objective that the 1 PPCLI battle group had trouble dealing with about a month earlier before Medusa.
So it wasn't really a school?
No, not a school at all.
I had a field troop in the north attached to Bravo Company, and they were staging out of Patrol Base Wilson. The idea was to sandwich the insurgents in Pajmal by approaching from the north and from the south across the river.
With an attack launching from the south, there was a chance that the enemy would begin to withdraw north, where we would be waiting. Hammer and anvil kind of strategy.
With 3 companies worth of labs, we were the most powerful fighting force since the Soviets were there. The Americans had nothing like that. In the end, we were it. We were the only show in town that could do the job.
This was going to be the biggest battle NATO's ever had, before or since.
The orders were they're going to do 3 days of aerial bombings. So they were going to soften the defenses up of the Taliban. We had actually dropped leaflets saying, you are to leave this area. And they had marked off, if you're found in this rectangle, you will be seen as a combatant and you will be, taken out.
We started seeing people sort of surging out. We were checking people, searching people to make sure that they weren't armed or, Taliban trying to flee the area.
Picture like a classic movie where all the civilians are fleeing, And yet all the soldiers are going in the opposite direction.
Once they started with the airstrikes, we're sort of hanging out on the sidelines, so to speak, waiting for the order to move. Anxiety was starting to kick in.
The initial plan called for 48 to 72 hours of bombardment to soften up the target. The decision was made to abridge that by General Fraser, I believe.
To use air power alone and just bomb everything off the face of the earth would not have defeated the enemy. They would have moved out of the way, or they would have hunkered down in holes, because you can't destroy everybody who's hiding. Doing that also disenfranchises everybody who owned a house there. We were not there to destroy the homes of people.
Combat is basically everything we had trained for up to this point. So yeah, I'd say we were kind of raring to go. We really had no clue what was coming.
Charles' company then was to advance across the river and get up onto the White School and seize it. Ideally, it would have been unopposed, but what they drove into, Charles' company drove into, was a very determined enemy.
When we first pushed off, it was pretty quiet. We hadn't seen combat up to that point, so we didn't really know what to expect or you know, what we were looking for, really.
We dismounted from the labs, and then we went forward. It was disheartening, you know? Like, you're looking around like, why are we walking in a line, straight line, you know? World War I style. I remember looking up and seeing this green pen flare. And I thought, man, that's weird. Why is there a pen flare just going up in the air? The Taliban had sent this up, and that was the signal letting everyone know that we had gone far enough into the trap. Charles' company literally marched into the guns. Then they open up.
They essentially lured us into that kill zone.
All hell broke loose. A rocket took out a sergeant. And another rocket took out a Lav with Rick Nolan in it. Both were killed instantly.
That was the first time that I came under fire.
It was a withering amount of fire that Charles' company was being confronted with.
I can hear the rockets and the bullets flying. There's about 400 Taliban that are dug in, and we're 2 platoons, so about 80 soldiers.
I remember hearing it on the radio. They were getting hit hard. And even though you can't see it, you know that things weren't going right for them right off the bat. And there was a genuine worry, and you start to get that feeling in the pit of your stomach.
No time did I ever feel like anybody had overall control. People didn't know whether they were coming or going. It was chaos. Frank Mellish actually took over this section. He was meant to be a soldier. Like, he was born with a rifle and standing at attention. It was at that point that this black football-esque metal object screamed right by me. It was a rocket. And it was at that time that I realized Frank was no longer standing there. Frank had been killed by this rocket, along with Private William Cushley.
Let's go, move back. Hey, let's go, we're moving back.
We had our asses handed to us. We lost.
I'm right.
It was devastating. We were rock stars till that point. We were indestructible to that point. You know, nothing had really happened to us. And that it brought everything crashing down.
There's a weight of responsibility that goes on a commander's shoulders that I don't think, unless you've ever been a commander, you understand and appreciate how lonely it is and how much of a burden that is. Everyone thinks about killing the other person, but you actually are going to kill your own people, and you can't avoid that. If you thought that fight that you've just gone through was bad, tomorrow is going to be absolutely worse. The Taliban that day got lucky. Charles' company had done a great job getting onto the objective, but the Taliban got lucky and killed 2 NCOs and 2 soldiers. And as a result of that, we had to recock and attack again onto the same ground.
The next morning, we had our orders. We were going to cross again, and we were going to do the show of force again.
One of the opening salvos was going to be a strafing and bombing of White School by A-10s on the morning of the 4th. And that's exactly what transpired, or where things started to go wrong again, as we now know.
The way the sun rises in Afghanistan is such a weird way. There's this hazy, dingy light that comes up. The sun was trying to cut through this smog, this pollution, this filth.
I remember seeing the A-10 circling around us, and I remember looking up at it, and I was like, oh, it's a good feeling to have that there, It's a formidable aircraft. It's deadly, absolutely deadly.
I watched the A-10 roll in. We all let out our cheer because the A-10, when it does roll in and let loose its cannon, makes an incredible, kind of a chainsaw ripping noise.
It's such a haunting sound. I don't even know how to explain it. It's loud, and it sounds like almost like a moose call, but it echoes. Just echoes off the mountains. It's so loud.
And the next thing I know, I'm tossed in the air. I remember I land face first and skidding across the jagged rocks and this dust.
I remember marveling at the aircraft, and I was like, I turned to the guys over the side, and I was like, looks like somebody's getting breakfast, or it looks like somebody's eating it, or something to that effect.
It was then that the blood began to pour down my face, and I'm trying to catch it with my hands. I'll try to save it, I guess. And as I'm trying to save this blood, it begins to overflow. There's so much blood pouring into my hands that I have like a handful, like when you wash your face and you let it fill up. I sit before you as a man that knows what it's like to feel the wind on his exposed brains. What turned out to have been an American A-10 Warthog had accidentally strafed us.
And the pilot was looking at Charles' company's garbage pit where they had eaten breakfast and were burning their garbage before mounting their vehicles to fire me in. And so when the pilot had rolled in, instead of rolling in on the school, he rolled in on Charles' company with a couple of bursts of his cannon.
The radio cracked, and there was pure panic on the other end of that radio. I remember them saying friendly fire, and my stomach just sort of sunk right there. I felt sick. I remember throwing up over the side of the vehicle.
And how bad is it? 1 killed, 34 wounded. And it was just like, I remember I repeated the number and I said, what?
And so essentially the Battle of Panjwai was over for me. And in the 48 hours, 8 platoon had gone from 40 to 5, from either killed or wounded.
That's something I'll never forget. It's not the way soldiers are supposed to go, Not friendly fire.
Where are we going to go with this next? We've now made 2 attempts on this and stalled. We had to regain our momentum. We needed to do something. We had to take the fight to the enemy, and what were we going to do? It had to be done rapidly, because now we're on the world stage, and the Taliban are watching.
We are the only people here on the ground, right? We need to sit here and figure out how we're going to take this objective, because there's no one going to come down here and help us. It is us, what we got on the ground.
It was decided that clearly if the Taliban now have amassed and concentrated their force south to confront Charles' company, they must have left the back door open near me. I would attack from the north.
Our OC, Major Apthorpe, came out and told us, we're probably going to be thrust in as the tip of the spear. So be ready for that. you know, basically his way of telling us, game time, pull your shorts up and let's go.
This is it. It's going to be a hard fight. We will succeed in this effort and defeat an enemy in a very small piece of ground, but a very important piece of ground here. We recock yet again. We're not going to show the Taliban for a third time where we're coming from. We're going to slowly move down from the north and come down and build our own road to nullify the IED threat with all the roads that are there. So we take 2 bulldozers and we create our own path.
The Canadian bulldozers that I had in my inventory, our heavy equipment is, it's old.
Major Gasparotto wasn't happy with the state of the armor and the equipment. Tapping into the ingenuity of the sappers, they found their own armor. They welded it onto the civilian equipment. We did our very best to make these bulldozers and the rest of the heavy equipment as safe as possible.
The soldiers called it Mad Maxing from the movie.
I formed the company up on the night of the 10th to give them the pep talk, to give them the speech that a commander ought to give them, that we're going to go into battle, to prepare yourselves and so forth. But I wanted everybody to remember the significance of September 11th, 2006, that would be the day that we finally really took the fight deep into the Taliban heartland at that point of where we were going.
Very soon after, we began to launch our offensive from Patrol Base Wilson south towards the White School.
Scared, excited? Excited and scared. Anybody that says they weren't scared was probably a liar.
We moved in a highly methodical manner whereby artillery and aerial bombardment would hit for the enemy positions on the front line. Infantry dismounted would then sweep out to take that new line, which would then allow my dozers to move forward and create a breach or a lane in the grape fields or over the wadis, which then would allow the lavs to come forward.
I remember thinking a lot of things during the firefight. Is this real?
Go, go, go!
It was exciting. It was exciting. When I say it's fun, I can think of a lot more fun things to do than being shot at, or even having to shoot at another human being. You know, I wouldn't call that fun.
They were prepared to die for their cause.
These roads, the intelligence told us, were full of IEDs, and we found hundreds of them. The enemy places roadside bombs and IEDs along roads. So the best way to not fall victim to an IED is to avoid roads. It involved collateral damage, but it also resulted in avoiding IEDs.
I remember telling the task force, destroy as little as you possibly can because people have to move back there afterwards. You know, knock down walls, which we can rebuild, but try not to knock down the whole compound, which we don't have to do. So when the families come back, we don't become the enemy.
I remember one bulldozer. I remember watching the guy bulldozing with the optics on the vehicle, and he hit an explosive device. And you know, whether it was an old landmine or it was something that they had planted, but he hit an explosive device in front of his vehicle. I remember seeing the huge plume of dust. There was so much chaos going on, they couldn't figure out who it was, and that's when we heard Josh's name over the radio.
What's his full name?
Joshua James Kluge. Really, in the end, it took a friend dying to make me realize that this was a horrible, horrible thing.
You mean the war?
Just war. War is a terrible, terrible thing.
By the time we had made it down to the White School, the enemy had largely withdrawn. And they realized that they couldn't fight our overwhelming firepower.
We finally owned the White School after weeks of blood, sweat, and tears. We'd finally taken that piece of terrain, which became very much a symbol to the Taliban and their holding out. We finally had dislocated them.
Operation Medusa, certainly the shooting portion of it had come to an end.
Success.
The mission was achieved in the end, yes.
Following our successes on Operation Medusa and their losses, the Taliban truly realized the absolute overwhelming amount of firepower we were bringing to bear. And even in any dedicated man's mind, there comes a point of futility of why am I going to stand here? I can run away and fight another day.
Our assessment is we've probably killed 1,000, which is just disgusting a number. So we probably killed most of their command and control in the area. It was just horrendous.
In terms of numbers, nobody can really afford to lose that many people and to lose that much real estate. So I would say that it pretty much, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for the Taliban.
And so, in classic insurgency fashion, they further blended and they withdrew.
Operation Medusa, it was a pretty big turning point in the Kandahar province. I think it was a huge victory in terms of taking away real estate from the Taliban. We did that. We took away part of their control, loosened their grip. We basically, we kicked them out of their home, took them out of their birthplace. We took it away from them.
I sincerely believe that Operation Medusa was the battle that saved Kandahar and protected the legitimate government of Afghanistan. Without it, I believe that the insurgency would have spread like a cancer through the suburbs of Kandahar city and completely toppled that local governor. And then the rest of the country would have followed. So Operation Medusa showed the resolve of both the coalition and the government of Afghanistan to stop the insurgency from spreading.
After the Operation Medusa, they changed their tactics from coming into a direct fight with us to the traditional guerrilla warfare. But what ended up happening was we didn't look at the root cause that caused this whole issue, so population went back to supporting the Taliban, and the Taliban came with even greater resurgence because it said, see, here you thought they were really going to help you, they didn't again, did they?
We were doing, I think, a lot of the right things. We were not going to win that conflict in the year that we were there. All we could do is just move the yardsticks a couple inches down range and hand it off to the next guys, because this was a conflict that was going to be measured in a generation or two. We wear the watch, but they have the time.